changes to the needs of homeowners through the weatherization work that we do through Miss Phillips' shop. So with that,
We are live.
so for those who we're just getting back online. So good morning. It is Thursday, January 26, 2023. This is the second half of Senate Natural Resources and Energy's morning session. And we are joined this morning by two folks to help us understand other resources that help Vermonters stay warm in winter. So with that, I'd like to turn to Ms. Kusina to talk to us, teach us a little bit about LIHEAP.
Good morning. My name is Nicole Tuzia. I am an Economic Benefits Director at DCF, and I oversee the program teams, including the LIHEAP program. So I did provide a little bit of written testimony that I'm going to go over today. I'll try to keep it brief as I know you are running a little behind schedule today. So
Very much.
The Seasonal Fuel Assistance Program is designed to help Vermonters pay for a portion of their home heating bill. We serve currently about 20,000 Vermonters, and depending on how those households heat their home depends on how they receive their benefit. So households that heat with wood or pellets receive a benefit on their EBT card so that they can purchase that wood or pellets directly. Whereas households that heat with oil, kerosene, propane, coal, gas, electricity receive their benefit directly through their fuel dealer. So we send those benefits to the dealers in November so that they can use those benefits as the heating season continues. So the eligibility criteria really has to do with, with the federal poverty limits. So on the document is a chart of what the household income thresholds are by household size. And then based on the household's income, the primary fuel type, the type of a household, if it's single household or multifamily dwelling, and the number of bedrooms, excuse me, depends on or determines the amount of benefit a household receives. So for example, the smallest benefit a household could receive is a household at 185% of the federal poverty level who heats with natural gas in a multi-unit dwelling who has a 1-bedroom unit. And their benefit would be about $164 a year. Whereas the maximum benefit that we would give out would be to a household who has 0 income, who has a 4+ bedroom house in a single family home, who heats with oil. So the benefit depends on, again, the bedroom size of the house, whether it's a single or multi-family dwelling, and the type of heating as well as the income. Our average benefit in the current fiscal year was $1,375 per household, and that again went out in November. That is a really good number. I want to leave time for questions.
Sure. Can you remind us of where you receive your money from and how much you receive how much you get? And
yes,
that amount changing over time or pretty steady?
The LIHEAP program is a federal block grant program, and Vermont receives about $21 million a year. For the last 2 years, that money has increased due to the coronavirus relief funds we've received. So last fuel season, we received closer to $50 million. And this year, there was just recently an additional federal amount of, I believe, about 5.8 that Vermont is receiving in the next couple of months. But the typical benefit or the typical amount we receive is about $21 million. And prior to COVID, that amount had not changed in several seasons.
Okay. And as I walked to the State House this morning, a guy was delivering heating fuel. I said, what's the price today? I said, $5.99. So pretty high price. What happens as the price of fuel goes up? I mean, it sounds like you can't deliver as many gallons, right? You have a fixed amount of money. So how do you manage that?
Right. So we work with the Fuel Dealers Association to try to determine what the cost will be for the season so that we can provide the largest benefit possible to households. This year, we did come to the legislature. We went to work for the Joint Fiscal Office back in the fall and received some additional state funds, which is not historically been the case for this program because we did know that this winter we would have higher than normal costs.
Okay, and how much state money was added?
Believe it was 3.8, but I don't know off the top of my head. I can get back to you on that.
Okay, thank you. Senator Watson.
So you've explained how the money flows for wood or pellets and oil and propane. What if somebody heats with a heat pump?
That would be converted to electricity, right? So the primary source of heat would be electricity.
Right, and so how does the money flow?
Electricity, we pay the electric vendor directly for their heating benefit.
Okay, thank you.
So is the basic math that you're looking to deliver the same number of BTUs per household, and then you adjust how much that gets translated into how much oil you could get, or how much electricity, or how much wood you could get under the program. But basically, regardless of fuel type, you aim to have the same level of benefit regardless of fuel type.
That is correct. So the average household under the current season, we are looking to cover about 45% of their heating need. And so based on the cost and the different types of heat is how the behind the scenes calculation works.
Great. Anything else that we didn't ask that you say, well, if you want to understand lighting, you ought to know this?
Not that I can think of. It's one of our more straightforward programs in terms of it just depends on those basic elements of income, fuel type, number of bedrooms and households type.
Do you have the ability to pre-buy and get more bang for your buck on fuel, or do you buy it? You know, you're a giant customer in aggregate, at least. Do you have the ability to get a better price than people shopping Muncie?
Unfortunately, we've been unsuccessful in that endeavor. We did research that, I want to say about 5 years ago with our federal partners. And because the benefit has to be on a household level, pre-buying is not a possibility.
Senator White.
Thank you, Chairman Gray. And I just want to say thank you so much for this program. As an individual, I personally had the advantage of using it, and it is the reason I was warm for a lot of my childhood. I have a question in regards to folks who are applying for it, and if you think the numbers of people applying and being in the program are actually reflective of the number of folks who have a need for this program.
We have seen an increase in the number of applications that have come in this year. I think we're up about 1,000 households where we were from last year, and that very likely could be because of the current winter and the current heating costs. Outreach efforts are something that we do every year. We focus on seniors because we have federal funds that allow us to work directly with the area agencies on aging to work with that population.
The 185% of federal poverty level, is that federally prescribed? That's your maximum level at which someone is of income in order to be eligible?
The federal guidelines are actually 150% or less, and Vermont has been able to expand that program through some swap funding, so that we swap some LIHEAP funds for some funds through the Office of Economic Opportunity Weatherization Fund. So we're able to fund that 150 to 185%.
I remember you explained that to us 2 years ago, and I couldn't possibly recount the special accounting that allows you to do that. Well, great. So with that, I'd like to thanks so much for the quick tune-up on LIHEAP. I'm going to Ms. Phillips. Good morning. Good to see you again. Thanks for jumping in. Again, you know, the point of checking in with you this morning was in the bill, in S5, we are trying to be flexible, clear but flexible about how we express who's eligible. And so at this point, we don't say that we're defining, for instance, low income as 80% of median or using FPL numbers, because we know there are different programs out there that use AMI versus FPL. So we are trying to be flexible in that. Some people say, well, that flexibility is actually confusing. You ought to pick one. So I'd like, I think it would be helpful for the committee to hear how you determine eligibility for the low-income weatherization program in what units, and if you have any advice for us, because the heat program will certainly interact with your program. So we're trying to make sure that we choose the right units in order to have a smooth integration with other programs. So can you fill us in on what units you use for your eligibility and what we should keep in mind in terms of how S5 expresses it?
Yes, for the record, Sarah Phillips, I'm the director of the State Office of Economic Opportunity in the Department for Children and Families, and our office administers the Low-Income Home Weatherization Assistance Program. I did provide the committee 3 documents that outline how we determine eligibility for weatherization. Rather than share those with you because they go through sort of the administrative process for determining what constitutes income and so on and so forth. I think to answer your question, generally, our program is called the Low-Income Home Weatherization Assistance Program. And generally, we are serving households at 80% of area median income or below. And in the weatherization field, that's recognized with our partners at EBT is considered low income. I want to be clear that we use the HUD median income measures, which look at household size, which is an important factor in considering income or in considering equity, right? $75,000 for a household of 4 is very different than $75,000 for a household of 1. So household size is a part of how we determine income eligibility. The other piece that we also use the HUD median incomes. That allows us to look at median income by county, which takes into account different incomes across the state. The other distinction perhaps is when considering whether or not a household is a tenant and multifamily weatherization. So generally, if a building has, we can do what we call rent qualify a building, which means that rather than having every tenant in a building apply to the program and be found income eligible, we say that if one tenant in a building applies and they are income eligible for the program, that we will qualify the building as eligible for weatherization if 50% or more of the units in the building have their rent set at such a level that it is at or below what's considered affordable for people who have incomes at 80% AMI or below. So that's called rent qualification, and the chart for that is in the materials I shared with you all. Those rent levels are set by looking at HUD median income and looking and considering what's affordable for a household. If they are paying 30% or less of their income for rent, what would be considered an affordable rent? So we rent qualify buildings. We also automatically qualify homeless shelters for the weatherization assistance program. And then finally, there's a what we call our shorthand, we call a HUD list that is available from the Department of Energy that automatically qualifies some buildings if they are HUD compliant per requirements of DOE. So that's another way that we would qualify a building as eligible for low-income home weatherization assistance. So I'll stop there. That's the general overview.
Great. Well, that's very helpful. Senator White, then Senator Watson.
Thank you, Chairman Bray.
And Senator McDonald.
Thank you, Chairman Bray. So in the Affordable Heat Act S5, we do have a call out for on, if anyone is interested, on page 10, where it has that a clean heat measure delivered to a customer qualifying for a government-sponsored low-income energy subsidy shall qualify for clean heat credit. So we automatically kind of include that. I'm wondering if you have any comment on if that language is goes far enough to make sure that the folks that are being supported by your programs, like a rent qualified apartment building, would fall under this?
I don't know that I can comment on that. There's a lot of questions around how it would be administered. I don't think there's enough detail and understanding how this program would be administered to be able to provide additional comments on that. I know that you're hearing from Secretary Moore later today, who's going to talk about some of the analysis and the work that the Agency of Natural Resources is doing around the program, or that you all are considering. I think there's a lot of questions that remain around how it would dovetail with existing programs.
Okay. So if I'm understanding correctly, you're not sure if the language that does specifically call out that someone qualifying for these government sponsored programs qualifying would actually do that.
Yeah, I think taken out of context of how the whole program would be administered and how I think it's not possible for me to answer that question.
Thank you.
Would it be, instead of relying on naming particular levels, for instance, FPL levels or AMI levels, does it seem workable if we were to say that whatever homes, I'll just stick with homes that qualify for LIHEAP or homes that qualify for low-income weatherization also qualify in our program. So we cite your program rather than the levels as a way of qualification. Does that seem like a workable way of expressing the connection? Maybe you want to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think taken out of context of how the whole program would be administered, and how I'm not sure that I can tell you what would be administratively feasible or would work the best. But generally speaking, there are programs that find people categorically eligible, right? Which would be like, if you qualify for this other program, you are automatically eligible for this program. I think categorical eligibility is a fine way to approach eligibility. I would say that it's important to define what low income means and what moderate income means in our field of weatherization. And in other fields, low income usually means 80% of HUD area median income, and moderate income means 120% of area median income or below. And so moderate income being that sort of between 80 and 120. That's a very standard measurement when we, income eligibility, when we think about income in relation to housing and energy programs. So I do think it's important to be clear about what low income and moderate income means.
Great, thank you. That's part of why we're speaking today, is trying to make sure we get the language right so we don't leave someone stranded, ineligible through because we didn't use the right words. The other question I have is there are concerns about how someone is determined to be eligible. So when someone is qualifying, what is the method you use to determine what your income is? While also maintaining, I suppose, a certain level of confidentiality. Do you do that all on your own through your own data systems, like interviewing people and collecting the data? Do you rely on Department of Tax for data? How do you make those determinations of eligibility?
Households that apply to the program apply directly to one of our weatherization assistance providers. The application is online, and part of the application process is providing information about their income. And there's a lot that goes into considerations of what is considered income and what is not. I don't know that it's relevant necessarily at the level of state policy making to get into the weeds of that. I think that kind of work around how eligibility is determined and verified can be something that happens at the regulatory or the program policy level. It's complicated, but generally people are providing their own information. If people are saying that they're LIHEAP eligible, we do auto qualify people based on whether or not they may be enrolled in other programs. We do, because we use LIHEAP funds to support the weatherization assistance program, our weatherization providers, again, not our state office, but the weatherization providers are looking to see which households qualify for LIHEAP and using the LIHEAP access database from economic services to verify that a household is LIHEAP eligible.
And do we still use things like eligibility for SNAP as, if you're eligible for SNAP, that's in essence sort of proof that you're eligible for LIHEAP or low income weatherization?
Yeah, I would have to have Nicole speak to what qualifies for someone is eligible for the LIHEAP program and how they're cross-referencing other programs. For weatherization, it's not whether or not someone is enrolled in SNAP, but if a household is enrolled in Reach Up, the TANF program, or in LIHEAP, then they are auto-qualified.
Okay, great. Any questions for Ms. Phillips? Senator White.
Thank you, Chairman Bray. So I really appreciate what you just described, where you said that the eligibility work would be something that at the regulatory level we would look at rather than potentially in a bill. And that's what I understood your comment to mean. And I appreciate that because I think the Affordable Heat Act, the language we have in here, actually does designate it to a regulatory authority. And I just wanted to highlight that it feels like we do have sufficient language in the bill to meet the request that you put forward.
Okay, great. So thank you very much. Good to see you again. Pardon me, Sarah McDonald.
I was looking at the report from Chair DeVal's group on purchasing fuel, money being spent on fuel oil in the bottom quintile of purchasers. The second quintile used about 40% more heating oil than the bottom quintile. Now I'm going to switch to why is it that people who get heating assistance can't pre-buy? What is there about the market which prohibits one class of buyers from pre-buying from another? Is this?
Yeah. Senator, thanks. I appreciate the question. And our office doesn't administer the low-income heating assistance program. We don't administer LIHEAP. I'm sure Nicole could answer that question. I think it's prevented based on their federal funding, is what I heard her say earlier. But if you needed more information on that, she would need to be the one to respond. I'm sorry.
We can follow up with her since Ms. Phillips doesn't address buying and pre-buying. Okay.
My memory of the general support for LIHEAP amongst the lobbyists that sell fuel oil is they're much more eager to have money spent on buying oil that goes through the roof than they are spending that same money to weatherize. And I'm not surprised, but do we have any?
Ms. Phillips
Yes,
does not
deal with it.
run that program. We lost our earlier witness, so we could follow up with her and ask about this, the fuel purchase question.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so thank you, Ms. Phillips. Good to see you, and thanks for the information. If we have more questions, we'll follow up.
Thank you. All right, take care. Have a good day.
Up-tempo transition. Welcome back to the committee, Secretary Moore. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
While we've been out of the room, we've continued to work on the Affordable Heat Act. So
Yes, I've been following along at home.
as you have too, I mean, in a way. So we had asked to talk with you again to see if, as you've been following along, if you had other information that you want to share with us, so we stay current with the administration's questions and or suggestions. The other thing was that you had mentioned budgetary impacts. We, in the initial cut from a year ago, there was no ANR appropriation. So we would like to fill ourselves in on that piece. And then you also mentioned last time that we all need in various different operating areas better data. And so I'd love to follow up on that. And I think that's probably enough to fill the 50 minutes we have.
Yes, I agree. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. And I know I'm saying we're in up-tempo mode. If we need more time, we will certainly slow down and schedule it, but
I appreciate it.
thank you.
So good morning, for the record, Julie Moore, ANR Secretary, and thank you for the opportunity to return to committee this morning for more of what is a challenging conversation. I'm going to start by focusing on the data pieces that you mentioned, Senator Bray. I sent a set of slides this morning. I don't know if they've been distributed.
No,
You got them on your.
They're online. But
Okay.
You told
So
me,
people, I will talk to them, but
I
people.
thought you brought some copies. Someone told me you were bringing copies.
Well, I said I would share the slides. Do you want me to share?
Do you have hard copies?
No.
Yeah, no, that was communication, yeah, sorry. I see the clean heat standard as a potentially powerful approach for addressing one of the most challenging and most significant sectors of greenhouse gas emissions. But I also think it's really imperative to separate that policy kernel from the process and timeline presented in S5. This is a massive and complex undertaking with real costs and practical challenges, and it's essential to complete the work needed to understand, account for, and develop workable strategies that appropriately distribute the costs and impacts of the clean heat standard before it's enacted. Absent this, I can't support this policy, say nothing of make the case to my boss that it's a good idea. So I'm here again today to implore you to proceed in a manner that leads to a data-informed and durable climate policy. Specifically, I see the following as tenets of good government that need to be considered through the process of crafting a clean heat standard. It should be data-informed, both what data is needed and then understanding what data exists. It should have administrative clarity and sustainability. This includes things like how clean heat credits are calculated and whether anyone would actually sign up to be the default delivery agent. We need to think about minimizing impacts and maximizing benefits to low and moderate income Vermonters, and I'm not sure that that evaluation has been completed yet. And there's a lot of work needed around public engagement and procedural equity, creating meaningful opportunities for local communities to participate in program planning and design. And I want to be clear that public engagement by the Climate Council in developing the climate action plan cannot be viewed as a substitute for public engagement specific to the clean heat standard. I'm also concerned the PUC has not been in to testify and share their perspective, as they play a central role, or the central role, in much of this work. In the testimony you've taken over.
Just so that people know of their schedule for next week.
Okay, fantastic. In the testimony that you have taken over the last 2 weeks on S5, a number of witnesses have spoken about the benefits of a clean heat standard, which are real, and notably include significant long-term savings for Vermonters transitioning from fossil fuel-based heat to clean heat solutions. But just as real as that $6.4 billion in estimated long-term savings and the attendant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions are the upfront costs of this work. They're also real. Unfortunately, the analysis and modeling needed to dig into the costs has not been done in that kind of detail. The best information currently available is in the Pathways report that was developed for the Climate Council. The Pathways report provides scenario modeling that is beneficial for visualizing the scale and pace of transformation needed to achieve emissions reductions. And it includes information on costs and savings by sector over time, but it doesn't really go further than that. There are a set of graphs that compare the savings and costs by sector. So you want me to say what slide? All right, so I'm on slide 5. There's a whole set of these graphs though that compare the savings and costs by sector. On the green line on this graph shows the net value at different points in time, which is the difference between the expenses that have been incurred and the savings that have been realized. We go to slide 7, I've hatched the area under the curve in red, and this represents the upfront cost to Vermonters. This is largely capital investments and things like heat pumps and weatherization that will be paid back over time with savings from reduced energy consumption and lower fuel costs.
Sorry, what's the horizontal time scale for that is what?
It's on the previous one. It extends out through 2050.
Okay.
So the green line crosses that $0 bar in about 2033, 2034.
Thank you.
So could you say that other than with colors?
Yes. Other than, let's see.
What is the information you're trying, I don't see colors.
Sure. So this area that's shown up here in hatching is costs that are incurred before benefits that exceed the benefits that are accrued. So we know that over time, as people switch, their fuel costs will go down, but there's a lot of upfront work that's required to obtain those savings. And that red shows us sort of this fundamental shift in costs where we're spending money we haven't saved
What
yet.
is red?
So this is,
It's just the hatched area.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. I'll endeavor to do better.
So is it just a quick question? So the crosshatched area, is that basically the size of the investment we need to be able to finance in order to get into that realizing net savings phase of the program?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. That's at the level of society too, not the level of the individual. Correct. And so I think it's important to keep in mind the actual impact on individual pocketbooks should vary, but what you would take away from this is there's hundreds of millions of dollars represented by that hatched area in near-term costs, and these costs need to be actively managed for the policy to yield those long-term benefits.
Do you have, I know it's ballpark, but do you have a ballpark figure for that hatched area?
Actually, Senator Ray, that's where we're headed.
Okay.
So I tried to calculate that essentially. If we move to slide 8, I use the Global Warming Solutions Act requirements and then numbers from the Pathways reports to develop a rough estimate of that gap. So try to make both conservative in the generous sense of the word assumptions throughout. The numbers of units of things required are pulled from the Pathways report. And this is essentially looking from today forward. 85,000 to 2030. 85,000 homes would need to be weatherized, 145,000 heat pumps installed, and 125,000 heat pump water heaters. If we go to the next slide, we know a rough cost for each of these. This comes from the Public Service Department's annual reporting of some of these implementation pieces. So doing some math, that estimated gross cost is about $2 billion. That doesn't include administrative costs. I think, frankly, the state government component of that is small compared to the default delivery agent. My understanding from Efficiency Vermont is about 20% of their revenue is put into technical assistance, not direct practices, but working with property owners to identify opportunities. And I did a gut check on myself and see that this is not dissimilar from what the Pathways report suggested for roughly the same period. It focused on net costs, so it did make some estimate of benefits, which I did not, and said it was about $1.6 billion in net costs with those fuel savings accounted for. So if we go to the next slide, we know that the Efficiency Vermont incentives for the residential sector for low and moderate income households right now are about 75% of the cost of most of these practices. However, I think given the timeline envisioned by S5, we probably need to assume that a higher incentive will be required to get the kind of uptake we need. So I assumed 90% cost share. So that 10% contributed by property owners reduces the unmet investment need to $1.8 billion. We are also in the very fortunate position right now of having lots of federal funding. Some of the out-year opportunities are competitive as opposed to the ARPA dollars that were hardwired, but I think it's reasonable to assume $75 million a year for 8 years of funding that can be available for the feds for investment in clean heat measures. So that's another $600 million.
So those are grant dollars, there's no tax credit?
Well, some of the tax credits are factored in there too. I'm just trying to reduce the gross number down based on that. So they may look like instead of the 10% I ascribe to homeowner costs, the homeowner may cover 40% and then get reimbursed by the feds, but the net effect on the math is the same. So now we're at this $1.2 billion number. If the clean heat standard takes effect on January 1st, 2026, there's been talk about fuel suppliers absorbing rather than passing along some of those costs. We know that this is something that's happened from RGGI, that the full costs of compliance weren't passed on to the customers. And so I've made an assumption that 25% of the costs for those clean heat credits would be absorbed by the fuel suppliers as opposed to passed on. So that means the sort of outstanding gap in investment needs is about $900 million or $180 million a year. I would then posit that absent dedicated state revenue, it is reasonable to expect fuel suppliers would seek to raise that revenue back in fuel sales. In an average year, and there's a lot of weather variability, as I'm sure you're all aware, Vermont sells about 250 million gallons of fossil heating fuels. So to raise $180 million a year on 250 million gallons would raise the price of a gallon of heating fuel by about 70 cents. And then as the amount of fossil fuel consumed annually drops over time as a result of the clean heat standard, that adder on remaining fossil fuels is likely to increase, but I have no way to project that out. So, I just want to own that this is really rough math. I would say I got my professional start in water quality modeling. And my boss used to regularly remind me, all models are wrong, some models are useful. I'm confident this is wrong. I could easily be off by a factor of 2 here, but I think the order of magnitude context is probably important, and would simply suggest that if you're offended by my back of the envelope math, and it's absolutely reasonable, you might be, I encourage you to see this as trying to make the case for the more detailed analysis and modeling that's needed to generate better numbers.
Yeah, absolutely not offended, absolutely appreciative. So the other direction, and we know that you're taking a cut at it, and it's very helpful for us to see the process. It's a lot, everyone likes to edit, no one likes to write. So you've written,
Correct.
now we have a chance to
Yes.
edit and work through the numbers and check the assumptions, stuff like that. So thanks.
And I just offer for context, some bullets taken from the 2021 report that followed on Act 62, which recommended increasing the fuel tax to expand low-income weatherization, not dissimilar. And I know it was a passion project of yours, Senator Bray, to what is needed as part of the clean heat standard. That was looking at an increase of 2 and ultimately 4 cents a gallon. And my understanding is that this recommendation was not advanced in large part over concerns for the hardship it might create for low-income Vermonters. We currently don't have the ability to consider how these costs actually play out across society and how they should be distributed because we don't have the data. It doesn't mean the costs don't exist. And from my vantage, it feels really disingenuous to not have this more detailed cost work be part of the upfront analysis and then support engagement with the larger Vermont community. I'm also eyes wide open that my math is just costs, not benefits. Early adopters will benefit immediately, and over time, the number of beneficiaries will obviously grow, but it's important to remain mindful of the growing impact on those who've not yet made the transition. So beyond more detailed modeling needed related to costs and benefits of the clean heat standard, I see several other critical data gaps that I think need to be addressed before a policy is implemented. The first I had mentioned briefly last time I was in, which is around fuel data reporting, and brought a copy of the current fuel data form for all of you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I don't file that one very often.
No. So this is what tax is collecting. And I think the take home point here is that it's the aggregate number of gallons of heating oil, propane, kerosene, and other dyed diesel. That's one lump number. It's not separated by fuel type. Sales of natural gas and coal are tracked separately, But this really does impact the ability to establish and appropriately value clean heat credits.
And I talked with Commissioner Bolio, and he said that you have a working group going.
We
and,
do.
Because although there's a form, he was also talking about how they have online filing, and that, I don't know if they're entirely filed online these days or not, but he said, I believe it would not be a complicated matter to disaggregate the data.
Correct. I think once they start collecting it, right? Like right now, there isn't any data to be disaggregated as part of our challenge. It is just that one volume number,
Right.
but your CARTIS indicated modifications to the form are fairly straightforward. There are some statutory changes required so that anyone other than tax can have access to the data too. Let's see, the next, what I see as critical data gap is a regulatory relationship with the obligated entities. So unlike Vermont's electricity utilities that have longstanding engagement both with the PUC and the Department of Public Service, the regulatory relationship with fuel suppliers will be new and is reasonable to expect some challenges. And it feels like with the timeline in the bill currently, it's sort of a hot start. It assumes we will immediately be up and running at full speed. Also, what I think of as the last customer problem, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, but how do we adequately consider not only the needs of those first in the door, but those later to make the transition, as inevitably someone will be last. The last piece I would flag as a data gap is around the deployment of clean heat measures and whether we have the ability to do the volume of work envisioned by this bill through passive incentives. Also, some questions about whether this allows comprehensive whole home solutions or if we will be put in the position of needing to push people to install heat pumps in other unweatherized homes in order to meet greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets.
Can I ask a quick question? So the passive, I just want to make sure I fully understand what you're saying around passive incentives. So
so, for example, in the space of Efficiency Vermont, which is sort of my mental model, they're not out knocking on doors, asking people to come inside and have a look. They have a range of services that are provided. They absolutely show up with technical assistance to help people make good decisions about investments they might consider in their home. They do some amount of advertising, but in general, what I'm saying is I'm not sure that kind of passive approach where it's really we have resources available if you would like to take advantage of them will generate the level of uptake that's needed to implement this policy. And in large part, that's because a lot of this work, not the weatherization, but on the heat pumps and water heaters, mainly the heat pumps, you're replacing something that from the homeowner's perspective isn't worn out, right? They're not in the market for a new furnace right now, and that's where we're meeting them where they're at. We're saying, would you like to replace your furnace that may still have 15 years of life left in it in service of our greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals? And I'm not sure that can be achieved through passive incentives.
sure, okay.
You start with some people who are ready next year or the next 6 months, the next 18 months to replace what they have now.
I believe you do. I think that is a hard group to identify and target necessarily, other than working with sales companies to ensure that these products are available and that they are aware of kind of the clean heat credits that might arise on the back end so that they're helping do their best to promote the uptake. But it may also run up against folks that homes just aren't ready for this. Know several people who've gone to install a heat pump to learn that they needed some fairly significant electrical panel work in order to support that. And that extra cost may be something people aren't prepared for as well. So it's complex, but I think there are ways to ensure folks who are ready. It's just the average life cycle of a boiler or a furnace is considerably longer than the period of implementation we're looking at between now and 2030.
On the passive uptake question, so we're going to have Efficiency Vermont in, and we can chase that down a little bit. My sense is, though, they fully expend all the dollars awarded to them every year. So, however passive or active, the program distributes all the benefits to achieve their performance targets. So, I'm guessing they would feel like, we know how to run a program that can reach people, even if it's one of the guidelines of this program is participation is voluntary.
Sure.
And, but I take your point, we need to make sure we keep the job too full.
Correct. And I think thinking about, or encourage you to ask them about the portfolio of services they offer, which I think is significantly broader than what's envisioned under the clean heat standard.
Sure. And to that point, affordable heat, the concept is that this is just one component of a whole suite of programs. So we have low income weatherization, we have the work Efficiency Vermont is already doing, we have pilot programs going through Efficiency Vermont in the thermal space. That we to address your whole house concern, which has been part of our thinking since tier 3, where it says the tier 3 work, we're not just looking to more efficiently heat the great outdoors. We're trying to have it be install those heat pumps, for instance, in an insulated home. So
yeah. Well, that's actually sort of a nice segue into some concerns I have about administrative complexity. First, calculating clean heat credits. I don't know if anyone in this room has tried to apply the methodology outlined in S5, but one of the technical staff at ANR did and was unable to work it through. And I think it's really important to prove out what is envisioned and make sure that that's usable.
sure.
Establishing a system for tracking clean heat credits is no small undertaking to track the work of multiple partners doing work in that space. And for example, right now, Efficiency Vermont and OEO, Sarah Phillips' team, both track project level data, but that's not compiled anywhere in a singular data resource. I would actually encourage you to hear from the Ag Agency, who in the clean water space has done a lot of work to establish a partners database to aggregate information on water quality programs and projects from multiple partners inside and outside state government that I think has some strong parallels to what's likely needed here.
Sure. Can you say the name of the database again?
I think it's the Ag Water Quality Partners database. I wouldn't swear to that, but I think that's what it's called. And then I think there's going to be some challenges around verifying early action credits. Appreciating the bill has those start to get counted 3 weeks ago. It's going to be challenging given that there isn't a standard for that work. And so how do you ensure a weatherization project done now is equivalent in terms of the credit it should receive to a weatherization project done on down the line?
I think Efficiency Vermont already, if there's a do-it-yourself program,
Yeah.
and so there's at least a model that says, if you go ahead and do something, here's your way of proving it out after the fact in order to be eligible for reimbursement.
I don't know that any of these, I should say, are insurmountable. I just see them as things that we need to be thinking about upfront and not after the fact.
Senator White?
Thank you, Chairman Bray. And that's actually my main question today. And I so appreciate your testimony so far. It sounds like there's actually been a shift. I would even say a thawing based on the information you've shared today on the perspective from the administration. So that's greatly appreciated. What I think I'm still struggling to understand is why these concerns would not be addressed through the rulemaking process, because that seems to be the plan that we've outlined in the Affordable Heat Act. And maybe you already have some slides prepared on that point, but I think even what has surprised me is the study that you've put forward that you have the RFP out for. It seems like that would perfectly dovetail with the process that's outlined in the Affordable Heat Act. So I'm wondering if you could either contemplate for us why that wouldn't happen, or if you already have prepared slides on that.
I do. I think it's really about timeline and what information is available when. I don't view the testimony I'm providing here as frankly different than what I've said previously. I don't. There isn't opposition to the clean heat standard as a principle, right? It's the question, it has always been questions about, do we understand the costs and impacts? And have we evaluated the importance and the utility of this policy in light of those costs? and
Yeah, and I think our foundational response to that is that's the purpose of the rulemaking process that we've outlined in the bill.
So let's get to that in a second. The carbon intensity of fuels is a new addition to S5 as compared to the clean heat standard passed last session. And I believe it adds an additional layer of complexity. I'm also concerned, or at least not clear, whether it's consistent with the assumptions around the needed use of biofuels that are in the pathways report that were used as part of our ability to identify feasibility. And I think that that needs to be checked and verified.
We'll be speaking, you had mentioned before, and Ms. Wynn from Oregon, who manages
Oh,
their
good.
transportation fuel program, which includes a carbon intensity
Yes.
model for us. I mean, this wasn't an entirely new creation. It was looking at those transportation fuel programs and their carbon intensity strategy to prioritize or assess impacts that we used in this bill.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you were able to connect with her. Another area of concern is about the equitable distribution of clean heat measures, and I know that's something that's received considerable discussion. S5 requires 32% of clean heat measures, a minimum of 32%, to go to low and moderate income customers. I guess my challenge is I'm not clear on how this percentage was arrived at. But data from the tax department using the 2021 personal income tax returns, which is the last year we have data available for, and what I think is a fairly standard definition of moderate income, which is 120% of MHI, median household income, finds that about 71% of Vermont filers are under that threshold. So this has S5 requiring at least 32% of heat measures to go to 71% of the population. I know that that's a minimum, but it doesn't seem like it probably would produce the intended result in terms of the equitable distribution of clean heat measures.
We will follow up.
Is it a concern that that amount of money is inadequate, or?
The concern is that the impact will obviously be most significant on low and moderate income customers as the cost of fossil fuels increases. My understanding of the intention of prioritizing low and income customers is to ensure they're at the front end of the transition. What I'm saying is there's a mismatch between what I think the bill saw as prioritization and the actual number of Vermonters that exist in those sort of income categories.
One nuance in all this is that 16% is in the residential sector, and the residential sector is 60%, I forget, this may not be the exact number, but it's like 60% of the fuel use. So you end up with 32% relative to, I think, 60, and so you end up with you're closer to, I think, the number I remember was something like, we came out at about 58, 60%. So the gap, so yes, we need to chase those numbers down, but just as a partial answer, the gap is much smaller than 32% to 71%, because when you look at just the pool of residential heating, it's a smaller pool. So 16% ends up being a bigger number in that smaller pool.
I guess I hadn't realized that the clean heat standard contemplated work in the industrial power space.
Okay, so I'll share the more detailed version that I can't cite off the top of my head to make sure I'm giving you clean and accurate numbers.
Thank you.
Chair
Right.
Bray, if you're interested, it is on slide 5 of previous testimony from Chair Duvall, the breakout.
No, I'm aware of that slide. I just didn't, it's more what the Clean Heat Standard or the Affordable Heat Act applies to, if it's the whole of that pie, or if it's really intended to be focused on residential heating and cooling, mostly. Let's see, the This gets at the question you'd asked Senator White about sort of timelines and what I think is really the underlying challenge here in terms of public engagement, procedural equity, but our ability to have the information we need to make informed decisions as we go along. So S5 allows about 16 months for the PUC to conduct pre-rulemaking engagement with stakeholders, draft rules, formally solicit and address public comments on those draft rules, and then prepare and submit final rules to the General Assembly. This is a really condensed, as somebody who does a lot of rulemaking, this is an exceptionally condensed time frame, particularly for policy that is essentially come from whole cloth. There isn't an existing policy we're modifying, nor are there necessarily a lot of clear surrogates that we can look at in numerous other jurisdictions. And I'm concerned it's inconsistent with both the guiding principles developed by the Just Transition Subcommittee and the directives contained in Act 154, the Environmental Justice Bill that was passed last session, that really emphasizes meaningful participation.
Senator McDonald.
When I went around knocking on doors, in towns that I have represented before, which gave me license to ask all sorts of questions that what they ask. One of the things I asked people was how they heated their homes. And your discussion of who's the last person in the door, I think we have a general idea of who the first person ought to be standing.
Yeah.
And those are the people that are replacing their heating systems that now or next week or last summer or this past fall. And what I was hearing over and over again in the extraordinary number of people that were moving here for getting away from fire country and floods and lack of water was, well, they contacted a fuel dealer. They were having a new boiler put in. They had money. They just bought a house, and that's what they were putting in. So if every day that we don't address this is another new oil system or a new propane system that gets put in. And last year we were in here saying, what about people who are putting those in, or that's their only choice? How do they pay for it? The cost of the fuel is up. It's unaffordable. And we can sit here and say, well, it takes a couple more years while they put in more and more systems that are going to be in place for 35 to 40 years, where maybe that money should be spent in doing a quarter of the transition or half the transition. Now, who's standing at the end of the line? This thing, Mike. I immediately was looking at the plane leaving Kabul Airport that was absolutely full of people standing side by side in an Air Force cargo plane, hauling them out of there. Those are the people that get left standing there. And every day we don't do something and say, well, let's just take another couple of years to work on it. We just put more people standing there with no way out in an unaffordable situation that each year gets more expensive. So, I made a remark a year ago that said every year we don't do anything, we have more and more people who, what do we tell them? To put on sweaters and get more blankets, because we don't have an answer for it. And we don't plan to have an answer for you soon. That's not what we're here for.
I guess
the administration's has been following this for years. What's the administration's plan other than, let's think about it for a couple more years before we begin to at least take the ones that need to put in a new heating system this spring, this summer.
So I will touch on a couple of those things as I finish out my planned remarks. I think you're pointing to something though that I believe that this work is challenging, hard, maybe even ridiculously hard. That it does feel like there's this incredible tension between moving as quickly as we can and moving responsibly. I would push back a little bit on the sense that we're not doing anything in the interim. There are significant investments being made in the very types of clean heat measures envisioned by this bill. So I don't think it's an either or proposition, it's an and both. And believe we owe it to Vermonters to do the homework while we're.
I couldn't be, there are things going on right now. And
Yeah.
one of the things that's going on right now is people going out and buying new oil burners and new fossil fuel burners. That's going on right now. And every one of those new things, people aren't going to tear out a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 3 years from now. And the fact that it's going on right now is it's a tragedy. We can't seem to help ourselves.
It's a little like the Will Rogers advice, right? If you're in a hole, first thing you do is stop digging. So with that, and to your point, Director Bailey was in yesterday from the department and followed up via email to enumerate the various categories of investment that are going on. So
Yes. Good, excellent. So just in closing, I don't want it to go without saying how deeply I care about climate action professionally and personally. And I also have serious concerns about the process and timeline and the ramifications this policy as drafted would have on our ability to actually drive sustained, meaningful climate action in Vermont. The clean heat standard is complex. I see establishing a clean heat standard is akin to the creation of Efficiency Vermont in 2000. It's broad-based, largely untested elsewhere, and deserves a thorough vetting. The potential benefits of this policy are real, as are the costs to Vermonters. But so far, the conversation is focused heavily on the benefits and opportunities as opposed to the challenges. In order to be successful, we need to be talking about all of it. Since the legislature was unable to override the governor's veto last session, staff at A&R and the department have continued to work methodically to fill in critical gaps and answer questions I've had and the governor has about the impact this will have. And as they dug in, they found things we didn't know. Fuel data being maybe at the top of the list or the easiest example. Put another way, and this gets to the point you raised, Senator McDonald, I don't see any of this work as another study or a delay tactic, but rather it's the work needed to have confidence our actions are in the best interests of Vermonters. This work is being done in parallel with accelerating implementation of clean heat measures, and we're taking full advantage of that significant federal funding to drive climate action, weatherization, home panel upgrades, whole home energy retrofits, heat pump incentives, the list goes on. So as I indicated, that I don't think this is an either or, where the needed transformation will stall absent the immediate adoption of a clean heat standard. I would offer the administration's approach is preparing for the long game, taking the steps foundational to Vermont's ability to decarbonize by 2050. You've indicated in your comments to other witnesses this week that you find this measured approach inconsistent with the urgency of the moment and therefore unacceptable. I believe this measured approach is good government, implementing policy in thoughtful steps to the end goal, which is hard, often complex, and demands time. There's a great quote I reflect on regularly from Eleanor Roosevelt. She was talking about healthcare, but I think it is apropos of this moment as well, which is we seem to forget that democracy functions by taking one step at a time. As more people become convinced of the value of something, it becomes more universally accepted. Democracies move slowly because they envision the approval of the majority for any new policy, and that means much education of many individuals. Ultimately, the policy solution may be some form of a clean heat standard. but the process and timeline for in S5 do not leave room for much education of many individuals. This is a disservice to Vermonters. I don't agree with it, and I can't support this approach.
Well, thank you. You know, were citing an interesting parallel that we stood up Efficiency Vermont 20 plus years ago, and it turns out that one of the architects of that was Richard Coward, who was then PUC chair, and say the principal architect of the Affordable Heat Act is this very same individual. So that the tolerance for stepping forward, well, varies. You know, I think we're highly appreciative of all the questions you're raising, and it will help us as we continue to work on the bill. It will help the PUC as they go through implementation. As the committee that did, I'd say, the biggest lift on S-148, the environmental justice bill, last session, we're keenly aware of that frame of reference, and we'll be talking to PUC about how that can be part of the process. The other thing is, as you know, the bill itself has an equity group built into it, because at that, as the predecessor bill and this bill being stood up, we still don't have a fully fledged equity group under EJ. So we're trying to ensure that even if that's not available to draw, that we'll still have that sort of community participation, not just during the development of the rules, but during the long period of time in which the program's envisioned to operate. So I'm just saying, sort of the view from my side of the street on this one. But I don't want to take all the time. So Senator Watson.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to come back to the Efficiency Vermont analogy and interested in the origin story of Efficiency Vermont. And is there anything that you could add about that, about like the origin stories of Efficiency Vermont and what detail was included, et cetera?
Yeah, I would actually be able to Ed if he knows more. I spent a not insignificant amount of time sort of studying the origin story when we were looking at how to pay for clean water, but was focused on a different component of it. I think it's a piece that merits discussion here, but we'll then love to have Ed round out, which is there was a real pain point for the utilities when Efficiency Vermont was created,
Sure,
right? They were
yeah.
being asked to do efficiency work that they were not very good at and struggled to meet their requirements for. So they had a real incentive to put up the money immediately to support that initiative, and also to act as sort of collaborators in the development of the utility. Part of what I'm pushing for here is that instead of utilities, much of this is talking about the work of individual Vermonters, and we need them to be equal collaborators in this space. And I appreciate Senator Bray, what you explained or reminded me of regarding some of the pieces that are in place to help bring voices and equity considerations to the table. I think the missing element of that is the time-bound nature of this process. It was a clear complaint we heard from the Climate Council that people felt like the timeline itself was damaging, and I feel like it's being repeated here. But in terms of bigger Efficiency Vermont, beyond just, it was sort of born out of this pain point of the utilities. I don't know, Ed, if there's anything you'd add.
Sure. Ed McNamara, General Counsel for ANR, related, used to work for Department of Public Service and PUC for 20 years collectively. So just missed the creation of Efficiency Vermont. I started in 2002 with Public Utility Commission. However, the genesis was in the early 90s when the PUC first required electric utilities to start implementing energy efficiency programs. As the Secretary just said, that over the course of 10 years realized that that was not the most efficient way of doing it. So the Department of Public Service, under then Director of Efficiency, Scarlett Parker, I believe, embarked on a year-plus effort with multiple stakeholders to actually develop the concept of Efficiency Vermont. So it was not something, if you look at just the legislative record, it seemed to happen overnight, but it was something that took 10 years and significant efforts behind the scene to actually create that. And then I'll also point out that over the last 20 years, there's also been significant changes from contract-based approach to becoming more like a real utility that's somewhat regulated, a regulated entity as opposed to a contracted entity. So there's been significant transformations at that time.
And, you know, thanks for that, Mr. McNamara. Because I think, well, the other things that I would anticipate, no one can say for sure like how this program will roll out. I think all the details, but if it is, and our goal is to have it well designed and that we're vigilant about how things are happening, and that it's a learning organization and it grows and evolves, just like Efficiency Vermont has changed their programming over time, as technologies have changed, as the lowest hanging fruit has changed, as their relationship with customers has changed. I'm figuring a program like this would start, and then as it engaged with people and as technology changed, all the very same things would happen. So I'm feeling like a robust, responsive, self-aware program can evolve and succeed. We don't have to see in the entire path in front of us. It's not to say that we launch blindly, but that we launch with, you know, what seems like a reasonable program with, you know, a very active due diligence piece. So, Mr. McNamara, you have your hand up, and then we'll go to Senator McCormick.
Yeah, my apologies. Just also wanted to add the legislation that created Efficiency Vermont, the electric efficiency utility, actually had a phase-in of the budget. It was statutorily set budget, started somewhere around 4 million. Over the course of several years, got to, I think, 17.5 million. Stayed that way for several years until the PUC was then granted the ability to develop the budget based on different factors. So I would say it was a phased-in approach. Just another example of the phased-in approach that we have.
And I would flag that I think the challenge is then with the 2030 requirement of the Global Warming Solutions Act, it doesn't provide the opportunity for a phased-in approach. We have that weatherization at scale curve that we've relied on in thinking about how we can weatherize sufficient units to be consistent with the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. There's no opportunity to go slower than that. And so I don't know that those phased opportunities exist in this instance, and I think that's something that needs to be carefully contemplated.
Well, and then the perverse thing is, if we delay another year, we make the slope even steeper to making a goal. And so I'm not disagreeing that there are big steps, but the longer we take to get started, the bigger each increment will be to be on track to meet those goals. Senator McCormick.
I think there's a qualitative difference between rushing or hurrying on the one hand and moving with all deliberate speed on the other hand. And I think anyone who's ever raised adolescents knows that sometimes that gets confused. You say, well, listen, we're going to leave in 5 hours, so whatever you got to do, start doing it now so you're ready to leave. You're rushing me, stop rushing me. That's a very common confusion. We are 40 years behind schedule on this one. Okay, we're late, and we're starting late already. Senator McDonald often points out how many days it was between Pearl Harbor and New J Day, because there was stuff that needed to get done. And people did not say, well, yeah, I'm all for beating the axis of this war, but let's not rush things. Let's do another study. But I do note that you had expressed concern about global warming, the governor has as well. And I do not go, there are people, we hear from constituents who say, you're on one side or you're on the other, and if you're not completely with our program, then you're completely against it. We have time, we don't have as much time as we should, because we're 40 years late. But we have right now, it's still January, we're aiming for an April adjournment, it'll more likely be in May. I take your criticisms, your entire testimony as recommendations as to what we ought to work with in the next several months. And I look forward to a lot of input from the administration, not only on what you don't like, but what you do want. No plan is a plan. It's a plan to do nothing. And it's not the governor's job, admittedly, to legislate. It's our job. But as I used to tell my students, the legislature tells the administration what to do, but the administration tells us what it is we should tell them. You are participants. You are,
Absolutely.
and I look forward to
Thank you.
to working with us on
So thank you. We're a little over. Last question, you sent her away.
Thank you, Chairman Bray. I asked Ms. Bailey this question, and she advised me that it would be more appropriate to ask you this question, so here we go. You put forward the RFP for this study. There's potential that you will get a recommendation out of the study. And my question is, would that recommendation that would be made be something that the administration would move forward with?
So the first phase is actually under contract and underway right now. We received our initial first draft of a deliverable from the consultants just earlier this week. The initial phases are sort of a survey of tools, and what I'm thinking will come back is additional recommendations around policy modifications and ways to structure. If a clean heat standard ends up being the central tenet of the recommendations from the consultants, things that may need to be added around the edges to ensure an effective policy, and also, frankly, some information about costs. I appreciate the 2030 requirement that exists in the Global Warming Solutions Act. I also, I guess, assume that there's at some point we reach a breaking point in terms of the cost to Vermonters by jamming this through in the next 6 years to achieve that requirement, where we might cause ourselves to pull back and reconsider about if there's a different pace.
So the answer to the question is no.
The answer to the question is I don't know. I can't prejudge what the feedback will be as the results of their evaluation.
Okay.
Right. The initial report, is that something you can share with the committee?
It's still draft, but as soon as we've got staff reviewing it to provide comments. Once it's final, I'm happy to share it. And that's the survey of sort of all the different possible approaches that are out there, including reports that have been done in other parts of Vermont state government, as well as by other state governments across the country.
Sure.
So I imagine that'll be finalized. I think their deadline is